Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 6th chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes. We read of two things: the futility of wealth, yet another futility in Solomon's trajectory, and also some of life's unanswerable questions form the second half of what we're going to read today. In the 11th verse of which, 11a, we read that in much words is much futility. And this concept originates in the antecedent chapter, the 5th, which we're going to review. So there are two parts of the 5th chapter. One is the word of caution to be circumspect in the presence of the Almighty. It's not a casual encounter. You cannot go on your own terms. Do not offer the sacrifice of fools. So if you bring an unrepentant heart in sacrifice, then you are missing the entire point. This is, you do not know that you do evil. So fools are foolish because they are ignorant, and evilness and ignorant are self-connected. This is the axiomatic assumption of wisdom literature by its antithesis. Do not be hasty with your mouth, and let not your heart hurry to bring forth a word before God, for God is in the heavens and you on earth. Therefore let your words be few. Let your words be few. You have to remember where you are and who you are talking to. The point of being in the presence of the Almighty is to listen, be slow to talk, quick to hear, as we read of in James 1:17. But you have to also remember, in the presence of whom you're talking to, God does not suffer fools gladly. This is also communicated in wisdom literature, such as a fool's voice is known by his many words. Fools talk because they are on a fool's errand. They just have a compulsive nature to advertise their very foolishness. This much is made plain both in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes by Solomon. So you're going to know a fool by where they are just because they are so foolish, and fools cannot help themselves. They're on a foolish errand of self-aggrandizement, which actually embarrasses themselves. They're just too stupid to notice. Then he cautions against, the severity and the seriousness of taking a vow. A vow is not a recommended course of action, especially when we remember that we are not saved by our promises to God, but by his promises to us. He says this in the 7th verse, 5th chapter: For in much dreaming, in many words, there is futility, but fear Elohim. So he compares dreaming to futility, and these are connected when we understand that the futility, the Hebrew original, is hebal, which translates literally as mist or vapor, and dreams are also elusive, without substance, without any concrete certainty of consciousness. They are in an ethereal plane, and we all have dreams, but the realist, the wise person, is a realist. They are not. They can be idealists, but ultimately at the end of the day, they are not caught up in foolish dreams. So it's okay to be an idealist if you have a dream with clarity and vision, but the dreams of which he speaks is more disparagingly of the futile, empty things. And then he says, fear God. This is what wisdom boils down to. This is the axiomatic assumption communicated in the wisdom psalm, the 111th verse 10, also Proverbs 1:7, knowledge, wisdom in 9:10 and 15:33, and then Job 28:28 says the same thing. This is the root. The assumption of wisdom literature is that wisdom emanates from and is uniquely endowed by an omniscient being, and the fear and submission to him is the key which unlocks the door to the wellspring of wisdom. He says this in the this transitions the earlier thing I forgot to mention about the second thing we read of in the 5th chapter is the trajectory, which is continued in the 6th on the futility of wealth. This actually begins in the antecedent chapter, but he says this. We're going to read verses 10 through 13. He who loves silver is not satisfied with silver, nor he who loves wealthy increase. That too is futile. Solomon had, gold was so plentiful in the reign of Solomon that silver was accounted for as naught. And Solomon, he certainly had a healthy attitude towards wealth. He was wise enough to have it all in perspective. He knew that all the wealth in the world and all the power and the prestige and all the wisdom could not satisfy him. God is the secret, and he ultimately draws closer to him as the narrative progresses. But money is a lot of people's gods. They worship to it. They think on it constantly. The getting and guarding of it is their constant pursuit, and that is futile. That is just a life it's a self-defeating life. With the increase of goods, there is an increase of those consuming them. What advantage then is there to their owners but to look on? Solomon lived in an extravagant palace, opulence all around, and the grandeur was such that he had 300 gold shields in his throne room. But one of the things, when you live in the palace, you're not the only one there. It's actually a huge expense, and Solomon was constantly entertaining. So it was from his bounty that his subjects were, just taking everything that he had, and then what is it? What does he do? But all he can do is observe these people drink his wine and lay on his couches and just do whatever they did in the king's presence. And he finds no benefit to being the patriarch of the party, so to speak. Sweet is the sleep of the laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the plenty of the rich does not let him sleep. To be plagued by insomnia is a potential consequence of the life dominated by the pursuit of gain and greed. So, people literally can't sleep at night because they think on money constantly. It just they can't sleep unless they, have what they need or want, or they just come to nefarious schemes. But far better to be a laborer and poor and humble and to be able to get a good night's sleep. So whether you sleep on a cot or in a bed, which would have been rare in the ancient world, kings certainly would have slept on them. He would rather be the laborer than be rich and be plagued by the insomnia that he is currently counteracting. There is the sickly evil I have seen under the sun, riches kept from their owner for his evil. This is strong language, but he is describing revolting sights to his eyes. So in the first 6 chapters, he is an observer. These are the recording of his observations, and that is the nature and the content of the chapter we'll be covering and the one we're reviewing right now, as is the first 6. But he crystallizes into conclusions beginning in the 7th chapter, but that's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. He says this in the 15th verse, 5th chapter. And he came naked from his mother's womb, so he returns to go as he came. And from his labor which goes into his hand, he takes none whatsoever. We are naked when we exit the world as we are when we enter. We die as we return. We return to the same. Physically, we are reduced to the dust from which our most primitive ancestor was molded. But also the futility of labor. He worked it all. He had this magical kingdom, a golden age of opulence and magnificence and splendor, yet he is not satisfied. He is a man on a lost search for satisfaction apart from God, but he ultimately does bring himself to the correct perspective. And then the word grievous evil appears again in the 16th verse, but he describes the days as in darkness, sorrow, sickness, and wrath. What's the point? That it's just part of the futility. And, he says that the gift is okay. It is okay if you are more grateful for the giver than the gift, because to be merely grateful for the givers is tantamount to idolatry. But to remember and have God in mind and in perspective as the creator and provider of your ability and capacity to enjoy, you have to accept that with just the most humility. We're going to begin the lesson itself, 6th chapter, 1st verse. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is great among men. We have no indication of what that evil is. We know that it is evil, and it is prevalent. It is kind of like what he says in 7:20. For there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and does not sin. So that just speaks of the same parallel element of the universality of whatever he is alluding to. We find that out in the next verse, which reads, A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and esteem, so that his soul lacks none at all of what he desires, but God does not permit him to eat of it, and a foreigner consumes it. This is futile, and it is an evil disease. So he is writing from the observation angle of the sick one. He is very much this man that he describes. He allowed himself to get caught up in the trap of riches. But all of it could not prevent the day of his death. This is his concern that he speaks of in the 15th verse of the 5th chapter. But he just questions the point because, eventually foreigners, the Egyptians, under the 22nd dynasty king who offered Jeroboam, the man who would eventually splinter the kingdom from Solomon's son and successor. He came up during the reign of Rehoboam, the 5th year, Solomon's son, and he expresses anxiety as to the quality and the moral character of his successor throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. And the king took his 300 gold shields, and Rehoboam replaced them with bronze. So his anxiety was somewhat accurate, shall we say. If a man bring forth 100 lives in many years, so the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, I say that a premature birth is better than he. Virility and longevity of life were tokens and signs of God's blessings, especially in the ancient world. So procreative proclivity, now we know that Solomon's son Rehoboam sired 88 children, 60 daughters and 28 sons, through significantly less concubines and wives that Solomon had. But also the record holder for this would be Ramses II, the outstanding pharaoh of the 19th dynasty of Egypt. He sired 111 children, and ultimately this created problems because the Egyptian social structure, so much of the king's offspring through their polygamous marriages would form the upper caste of society, and this ultimately spread it too wide. But the days of his years are many. Now in some translations it is 1,000 years too over. Methuselah is the longest living human, 969 years. Read of that in the 5th chapter of Genesis. But even if such a one were to live twice as long as him, he would what's the point? Because if all the longevity of life in the world cannot prevent your death, then Solomon would be going through the same thing he is going through now at around or after 50 years old, if he was 900 years older than that. And to be buried, to not have a proper dignified burial would have been a disgrace of all disgraces in the ancient world. And the superiority to the existence of a stillborn he also alludes to in the 3rd verse of the 4th chapter. For all the evil that is under the sun, it is better to not only not live, but not have ever been born, because the stillborn are at rest. They do not have to endure the toil of the earth, life lived under the sun. For it comes in futility and goes away in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. So it comes as it goes. It's just this vicious cycle and endless circle of futility of literally everything that is under the sun. Now Solomon is adopting the vantage point in the lens of the secularist, so he is walking by sight, but through faith all things become new, and the futility ceases, the vanity, the meaninglessness. We find meaning and purpose when we walk through with the eyes of sight, because we are able to perceive a subterranean world that is more significant than the carnal world we inhabit. Even the sun it has not seen, it has more rest than man. So he's still talking about the stillborn son. This is the same sentence, verses 3 all the way through 5. So it's better to not see anything at all that transpires all under the sun. It is all meaningless, it is all pointless, it is all for naught. Better to not be born than to live the miserable world, in this world of cruelty and oppression, which Solomon laments even on top of the world. The presence of oppression in his kingdom just really stirred his heart. He's in the 4th chapter. So as absolute as his power was, he could not prevent corruption from proliferating in his kingdom, try as he might. And though he lives 1,000 years twice over, yet he shall not see goodness. Do not all go to one place. I misspoke earlier. I should have said what I said about Methuselah after this. But even Methuselah, even all the antediluvian creatures who lived far longer than we do, and Solomon was one of the gifts. The wealth and the wisdom were unconditional endowments, but he was also promised longevity of life if he would maintain the faithfulness of the covenant path, and we find him slipping away at this later point in his life. So these are his expressions of a life in which he started to get away from the God who had gave him the wisdom and the wealth, and he eventually succumbed to syncretism through the influence of his pagan idolatrous wives. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet his appetite is not satisfied. The one whose mouth is their master rather than their mind, that is futile and feeding on wind. To live the life of the carnal creature is to render us indistinct from the beast, who Solomon also notes the futility of any advantage, any claimed advantage that we as human beings have over these inferior life forms. If their fate is the same fate as ours, if we die the same as them, then what is the advantage of being able to dominate and subjugate all the lesser life forms? What is the point of life itself if one day it has to end? This is the fact of life, and it's been going on in the seasons and cycles since before any of us were even an idea. And he notes this as early as the 4th verse of the 1st chapter. For what advantage has the wise over the fool? What does the poor have who knows how to walk before the living? So in the lens of death, there is no advantage. Wisdom can enable us to navigate through life successfully. It cannot prolong our life, and it certainly is powerless to prevent the day of our death. So having all the wisdom in the world, he denotes its significance, because wisdom apart from God can stimulate the mind, but it cannot transform the heart. And that is some of the secularist views that are expressed there. Solomon does ultimately bring himself to an optimistic prognosis, but then the words of Solomon end as they began. Futility, futility, all is futile. And 12:8, 1-2. Tail ends of the words of Solomon. Before and after that are the words of the actual author of the book of Ecclesiastes, who was not Solomon. Solomon did not write this book. He certainly inspired it. The ancients actually had oral traditions because their memories were better than ours, and so the Pentateuch was not in fact compiled or preserved in written form until the reign of Solomon. So an approximate the same distance as that which existed between Moses and the scribes who recorded the oral tradition is perhaps the same distance of the writing of Ecclesiastes and the utterance of. But what the eye see is better than what the will goes after. That too is futile and feeding on wind. So the lust of the eyes, our eyes are prone to wander. Of course, we have itching eyes, as the saying goes. We like to see new things and excite. But our eyes are the directions of our hearts, whether we know it or not. Because if we fixate our eyes on smut, is that honoring God? If we fixate our eyes on art, that's just an escape from life. If we spend every waking second being entertained. So enjoyment without God is entertainment, but enjoyment with God is enrichment. This is one of the principles communicated implicitly. Whatever shall be has already been named, and now it is known that he is a son of man, and he is unable to contend with him who is mightier than he. This is an expression of our powerlessness and our impotence, and much of wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes and Job especially, note the insignificance of frail creatures who are at the mercy of forces beyond their power to comprehend, far less control. But we are we cannot resist the divine providence or the sovereign will of the almighty maker of heaven and earth. That is his right and prerogative. So whether we like it or not, we have to live with life as we find ourselves in it. This is part of wisdom literature, and he does have an element of empathy for his socioeconomic underlings. He envies the ones who sleep at night because he is plagued by insomnia. He is dominated by the desire for the satisfaction that eludes him, even though he had every measurable advantage in the world, the unique recipient of divine grace to an unprecedented, unduplicated, unrivaled, and unequal extent. But he did not, the conditional gift that he had been given, the longevity of life, we find he lived tragically young, given the unique potential that he was given when he was 19 years old. But he did make it 40 years. He stayed faithful, a little less than those. The more words, the more futility. What is the advantage to man? There we go again. The more words, the more futility. Now, the economy of words. So a proverb of which Solomon compiled over 3,000 according to 1 Kings 4:32 is the concise saying of condensed wisdom. So since wisdom is easier to express in elaborate verbiage, the ability to communicate profound truths in simple statements, it may be argued, separates the wise among the wise from the merely wise. So, you can say a lot, but really there's just an economy of words, and I know, I do not myself cultivate the iceberg effect, but I do admire the ones who are more precise in their language than am I. The simplicity and just the profundity within that simplicity is the mark and measure of Solomon's wisdom. But a fool, contradistinctly, they have a lot to say, but they say nothing at all. They are motor mouths, but a fool talks because they have to say something. A wise man talks because he has something to say. Platonic philosophy. For who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his futile life, which he passes like a shadow? For who declares to man what shall be after him under the sun? Who knows these things? Who knows what's if he had the answer, he would not be on the motivation and pursuit. But this is his final. This is the final insight or input of his observational stage in the narrative of Ecclesiastes. He does not know what is good for man in life. This takes us back to 1:2. Futility, all is futile. This expresses his frustration at his search for satisfaction, with which apart from God is a lost cause. That is one of the messages of Ecclesiastes. But, life is futile because he is viewing it from under the sun. And the seventh chapter really is the most densely prolific concentration of the words wisdom. We read more about wisdom in the 7th chapter than we do anywhere else in Ecclesiastes. Proverbs 8 has that distinction in Proverbs, and Job 28 has that distinction in Job. These are the three wisdom literature books of the Old Testament. There are wisdom psalms, and wisdom is found and imparted throughout the entire Bible. Nevertheless, it has a specific focal point and concentration in a genre whose emphasis that is. But he compares life to a shadow, to return to the voice. I'm sorry I got away and distracted, but life is a shadow. One day it's here, one day it's gone, and it comes and it goes, and once it's gone, it's gone. And the tragedy is that none of us know what the future's what's gonna happen to us, to our memory, to our legacy, to our children, to our bloodline. We do not know, and this is one of the uncomfortable mysteries in which faith, having to live with and contend with, stimulates the necessity of faith. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.